There we go.
Thank you.
There you go.
So welcome for the May 17th CIAC meeting. We are just going to look at the agenda. Today is all about climate and EV update. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 21st, and we had intended that to be a hybrid meeting, an in-person meeting, and unfortunately I have had something come up that I cannot come to the Valley that day. I have a memorial service I need to attend, so I'm going to be remote, and I'm just wanting to know for the rest of the group, do you still want to try and meet in person, or should we just do this one remotely? Any thoughts, preferences?
I'll probably be participating remotely that day anyway, so.
Okay. Well, and Paula and Ted aren't here, so why don't we just table that discussion, and we'll follow up the meeting with a direction on whether we're going to do it remotely or in person. And I'll work with our team to figure that out. So I apologize for my schedule challenge. Without further ado, we can maybe launch into the topic, although I did want to make one note. Amber mentioned as we were getting ready for this meeting that she is going to need to step off the committee. So we will be looking to fill 2 spots. Seems like there's a lot of transition. So we'll just roll with it. And let's talk climate. Suzanne.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you. Today we were going to focus primarily on our STIP climate lens work, which is very timely. We thought we had a moment to sort of wrap up one version before we launched the next one, but everything's very much moving pieces and still inventing the bus as we drive it. But we have some good lessons learned from applying a climate lens to the STIP in the 24-27 cycle, regular cycle, and bipartisan infrastructure law, which you may also know as IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I'm going to go over what we did for 3 different phases, and then we've got some questions for you, and I'll just kind of do a couple like bite-sized pieces, and then we'll go to the question, and then we'll kind of tackle the next phase and have another question. And then the agency's having a lot of conversations now about how we do this next time. So that's where I think your role as continuous improvement is probably a good time in the cycle here to sort of understand what we did and answer some questions to help provide input into that. So I'm not going to go super deep, but I'll try to go enough that if people weren't there every day of the way, they'll have some overview of what we've done and what we're talking about. And then certainly leave discussion available for people to ask questions, and let me know if there's an echo. I heard an echo from in there. Okay. So as probably everyone knows, Executive Order 2004 asked ODOT to apply a climate lens to our capital investment decision-making. And so we did that with the 2024-2027 STIP over the last couple of years. So phase 1 was, we thought, as you saw in the cover letter, there's 3 points at which we thought there was decision-making that we would work to influence. So that first phase is the Oregon Transportation Commission making those investment decisions. So particularly with the more discretionary dollars that we get, where would we invest those, and what sort of outcomes do we want to get out of the dollars? So we set up a way, and I'm taking credit for past work when I wasn't here at the first go around there, but looked at how investments were made in the past STIP and made a methodology that if a dollar was invested into a certain type of project on balance in the previous STIP, that dollar, maybe 25 cents went to one outcome and 30 cents went to another. We kind of looked at that and figured out a way to evaluate the dollar. And then if we were going forward into the next STIP, each dollar spent would have a return on investment towards equity, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, state of good repair, multimodal mobility, safety, and congestion relief was the other one. So we applied that lens and provided information to the Oregon Transportation Commission to make decisions based on how they, well, let me add one more piece. We looked into past plans to figure out what the need was and gave a letter grade as far as how well we were meeting that need. So safety, for example, and I don't have all those scorecards in front of me, but basically assigned a letter grade to whether we were meeting the need in that area. And climate mitigation really came up in the back at, I think, a D- initially in terms of how well we were meeting what we would like to fund there, and just provided a lot of different scenarios to the OTC to make decisions based on how we could balance dollars towards those multi outcomes. We did that again with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and again, providing that information to the upfront decision makers. Phase 2 was a more internal process. So once dollars got put into different ODOT program areas, like Fix It, bike ped, transit, safety programs, that type of thing, then they're selecting which projects go forward. And so phase 2 was project selection and scoping. How could those dollars get applied to projects that would then have the highest output? And there we just looked at climate. So there we stopped looking at all those multi different outcomes and factors, and just really focused on climate. And there we worked with regional staff quite a bit. We set up a way to evaluate 26 different attributes, might have been 27, different attributes for projects. So was it, and then how many dollars were going towards each. And then we used a methodology to evaluate based on where the dollars were going in within the project, whether it would support climate outcomes, be neutral, like a culvert perhaps, wouldn't change user behavior, or be challenging to climate outcomes. So maybe a roadway expansion or something that made it harder to bike and walk and easier to drive. So it was a simple version of that calculation. So worked a lot with the regions, provided a lot of information. We felt we provided a lot of information around what this would mean and how you might choose projects that had a better outcome. And we ultimately did. We provided, I'll get into phase 3 after our next question, but we provided some information to the OTC in March that we did have supportive outcomes. But that stage was pretty challenging. A lot of the decisions have been made. A lot of assumptions have been made to bring projects forward. They were at a certain level of, not quite readiness, but a certain level of being baked and being desirable projects, meeting a lot of federal performance measures, that, especially for safety, for example, you have to use certain data inputs to pick a project. So we were working together with a lot of established factors, established criteria, established training processes and mindsets that made that, I think, a good exercise, but probably shorter on like culture change and game change around a totally different project selection, right? It was just a way to sort of inform and educate and discuss as we went forward. So we do have some consultants on board now, Pivotal, who are process change or change management type consultants. So they're listening to how people saw that and what the opportunities are to make a difference and the opportunities to do things differently going forward. And that we're kind of in the midstream of that work right now. And I would say a lot of people on this call, Mac and Amanda, are pretty deep in that and looking at what choices we can make and governance processes and structures to influence these outcomes. But I think with that, I will just kind of jump to our first question, and we can also go back and forth and provide more info to help you answer the question. But the first question we're posing is, how should we consider adding a climate lens beyond the STIP? So what I was talking about is just the ODOT-led projects that get introduced into the STIP. But what else might we look at? What might we look at, like statewide transportation improvement funds, routine maintenance and operation dollars, other type of ODOT investments that would be outside the STIP? We could probably go the other way too. Are there things that we did that were less impactful that we'll do less of? We're having a little bit of that conversation. But I think this main question here is just where might we expand?
Is it okay if I jump in? Oh, sorry, Amber, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Vivi. I'll go after you.
Okay. One thing I think about is where our funding comes from, which comes from the gas tax. And so I think it would, and that is, it puts the agency in a really sort of bad position in terms of like reaching climate goals, but like that is not in the agency's like best financial interest. And so I think it would benefit the agency to think through a funding mechanism that is aligned with climate policy and climate goals. And I realize that is like a really big thing, but I think, you know, there are ideas out there, there's things getting floated, like how can the agency kind of get behind those efforts and how can it do some math to understand what the financial impacts would be to the agency?
Yeah, my question was almost exactly the same, but a tiny bit different. Shauna and I, we think so much alike. So my first question was, does ODOT have a climate action goal or policy? And I'm assuming you do, but I can't remember what it is. And then the second question that basically is her question, which is, and so you kind of spoke to this, which is, while the money for ODOT comes from gas tax, the question that I have has to do with the different federal grant programs and how they can be obligated to address climate action goals. And so, for example, there are different federal funding streams that you can use as a mechanism or a strategy to achieve the climate goals. And so if you have a goal that, let's say it's 20%, how are you obligating those dollars in a way that meets those goals, the climate action goals?
Yeah, so Suzanne, do you mind if I
Go
jump in
ahead.
a little
No,
bit here?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so a couple thoughts. One is, I think, spot on, Shauna, from the standpoint of we are trying to decarbonize the transportation system at the same time that we have a carbon-based fee for collecting revenue, and that's not sustainable, nor is it helpful to the multiple objectives that we're trying to achieve as an agency.
Right.
And so, Amber, to some of your points as well, from a policy perspective, we have the draft Oregon Transportation Plan, in which I think we're starting and trying to solidify a lot of these things. So one is diversifying our funding sources, you know, beyond some of those carbon-based systems, looking at a vehicle miles travel fee, a lot of different options. There's still some funding restrictions within that I think will be challenging to supporting some of our climate goals. And in that way, I think spot on thinking about some of our federal funding and how we can more flexibly use that and pursue additional grants and other opportunities where we can really put climate first, so to speak, on kind of the objective of what we're trying to achieve. And I think what Suzanne's trying to talk about here overall is making climate kind of integral to decision making is not an afterthought. And as part of that, in the Oregon Transportation Plan as well, the committee kind of narrowed in. There's like 6 different goals, but like 3 of which show up in the vision statement. And what I would call those is lenses on every decision we make, and that is climate, equity, and safety. And so I think if we start putting those 3 things center as we make decisions as a transportation agency, we're starting to achieve some of those commitments. And then we're having some more recent conversations on like, how do we set some longer term targets potentially in the Oregon Transportation Plan that identifies where we want to go with vehicles and fuels, with vehicle miles traveled, with some of those kinds of things and ways to help give us a trajectory. I think the challenge we face in applying that in the practical and immediate sense is how does that translate to short-term kind of incremental decisions as we have to make incremental decisions on the budget. We do the STIP, we do the budget, we make changes over time. How do we think about that in a more cumulative sense? And we want to have this help identify projects at the same time. Sometimes analysis is benefited by more of a programmatic look and seeing how multiple things kind of add up together. So all that to say is I feel like we're starting to get some of the policy framework, really good points on some of the key issues we need to consider, and still a lot of challenges before us as we try to operationalize this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, I think that there's going to be this overlap for quite some time as you incorporate climate into your decision making. So STIP is one place, budget is another. You just named them all. Like, and there's going to have to be this like time. It's going to be years of discomfort where the sort of like legacy projects are working their way through the system. And there may be, you know, projects that are not beneficial to the climate while the organization sort of reorients itself to being really focused on that. And so I say that just because I think sometimes we're looking for that switch. And I think there's going to be several years of gray area. And I think, you know, Amanda, like you sort of said it, maybe I'm saying just in a different way, like, you know, you basically want to see that go down, right? Like at the early years, like it's going to be significant as those projects are underway. And then over time, and maybe we set a goal around, you know, by, you know, 2028 or whatever it is, like those projects are through the system and all projects have, you know, the following lens applied.
Yeah, I also think one of the challenges we have is sometimes the legislature gives us projects and says, go do these projects. And, you know, the only thing we can do is try and deliver them in a, you know, in a way that is as climate friendly as possible. But the challenge is we don't get to sometimes pick what we're doing. So looking at other sources where, you know, how can we proactively look for funding opportunities to advance our goals?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And part of looking at the programmatic level is that like any one project may have so like how do we in every single project try to maximize these outcomes that we want to see? And then across from a program and suite of investments, how do we balance things where some may be more negative, I guess this way, some may be more positive, and in the net, we're getting to kind of a bar that we find acceptable. And I think that's part of the second question there is like, what is that bar to help achieve? So for example, Suzanne and her team reported out to the commission 2 meetings ago on kind of the results of the STIP projects and how overall, if you look between embedded emissions, the emissions from the construction and materials used, the fuels used, as well as like how people might change their behaviors as a result of certain types of investment, it resulted in a net reduction, a very, very slight net reduction, which is in many ways to the point of it's going to take a long time, Shauna, to do this. Like, that's like, oh, we're doing pretty good. Like we've turned the, we've turned the corner. We've started to reduce emissions. Is it enough? Well, we have these goals we're trying to achieve and we're tracking through this emission website to see. And we've gotten to substantial reductions because of changes in vehicles and fuels. And there's still a gap. It's not a huge gap that it once was, but there's still a gap. And the challenge is that gap is going to be exponentially harder to close. And so I think that's that nexus we're trying to work in is how do we close that remaining gap that's going to be really hard? And then therefore, what is enough? What's that trajectory that we need to be on?
Go ahead, Amber.
Well, I just wanted to add another thought for ODOT to consider, which is, so this conversation is the bigger programmatic policy discussion around climate. But I would just really encourage ODOT to think about the way you construct projects, which is, so I worked at TriMet for many years. And so we actually would incorporate specific environmental requirements in our construction RFPs that mandated like so many different things that had a significant effect on climate. I mean, there's just so many things that you can do to encourage the contractors to buy resources in a climate friendly way, reuse, repurpose. I mean, there's just so many things that you could do. I would just encourage you to look at other agencies and the kinds of procurement language that they use to achieve some of these goals in a different way. Because then you could do it for every single project.
I wanted to back up and answer your other question a little bit as well. You talked about what was our goal. So we have the governor's goal, which I believe is still 80% greenhouse gas reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. did I just mess it up? 2035. So that's our goal, but it's very large and very ambiguous in a way. And we're meeting a lot of it with electrification and fuels. And this, when we talk a little bit about our phase 3, excuse me, the evaluation work, which Amanda led into there, we're making a tiny dent here. And this is really around vehicle miles traveled. So this is really that harder stuff. This is really, how did we encourage bicycling through a new project where we touch the system? And how did we help to shift people onto those modes in places where we touch the system? I'll go back on mute here.
Yeah, and if it's okay, Chair, just to address Amber's points, super well taken. I mean, I think the potential there is high as we think about how we incorporate that into the selection of contractors, into the standards and design that we have. I would say we're starting to dip our toes into that a little bit. There's a legislation on environmental product declarations. So I call these like the nutrition label basically on your cereal, but it's telling you what your carbon footprint is on your materials. That's a requirement. Mac and his group are kind of standing up a program around that. And I think the initial proposal was like, how do you use that in contracting and setting your design standards? So right now we're kind of in a phase of collecting information and standing that up, but the potential longer term certainly is there. And I know Mac and his team are working on some design standards around concrete and the mixes and some of those kinds of things, but definitely a great area to point out that we can learn from others on.
Yeah, Paula, then Shannon.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry I'm late, and I'm late to this conversation. So if I'm saying something that's already been talked about, I apologize. I actually talked to Travis Brower this morning about sustainability as kind of this theme. One of the things we're seeing, and it's hard in a DOT when there's so many disparate things that have to happen in different divisions, but we're seeing a lot of the private sector, large companies, say Microsoft is one, that is approaching all of these multiple goals from a sustainability title concept. And they're trying, you know, the whole net zero goal, but also to have resilient systems that are also a big part of what DOTs are trying to do. And then layer the equity goals. All of these goals that you have, you almost can't do them as one-offs. And I think there's some approaches from the private sector that might be useful in thinking about how you juggle and morph the right investments into accomplishing the most goals and doing the best you can. So I think there's a lot of tools out there. I'm not personally familiar with them, but I could certainly start looking to see what they're doing externally with the private sector as well.
Yeah, so Paula, great comments, and definitely if there's any resources you're finding or colleagues are aware of, certainly welcome those. So a couple things I mentioned earlier, just to kind of reinforce exactly what you're saying is, one, what we're trying to do is make sure these goals aren't additive or kind of viewed as later. We want them integral into the process and integrated into how we consider things. In our Oregon Transportation Plan that's draft right now, we've kind of, in our vision statement, identifies 3 goals in particular, and I really characterize these as lenses that we have to put on every single decision, and that is climate, equity, and safety. And so those are absolutely center of what we should be making every single decision with that in the back of our head. And then between the Oregon Transportation Plan, where we've done a lot of modeling and analysis of thousands of scenarios to really look at, you can find optimal ways to achieve multiple goals kind of simultaneously. And as we're working with a consultant on kind of integrating climate into some of our STIP processes, I love the quote of the beauty of the and is you can get to safe solutions and climate solutions and equity solutions. And there's a little bit of a fallacy when we say that, like, oh no, to do this climate thing or to do this equity thing, then we're moving away from safety or moving away from some of these other things. We need to be really thoughtful about how we get to those multiplier effects and realize that we can accomplish multiple things.
Somebody mentioned, I think, I forget who it was, a portfolio approach to measuring climate impacts. And I think the procurement process and supply chain is like, it's kind of its own beast. And then looking at sort of the way we invest in projects and the projects that we choose to invest in, like I really like the idea of bunching projects together and thinking about them in a portfolio way, because they're going to be projects that have a negative impact on, or a net neutral impact on the environment, like highway expansions or things like that. So that's one thing. I like the portfolio approach, and I need to think through kind of how you would measure that. And maybe you guys have already thought through it. The second thing is that the idea about changing behavior and how measuring how did this investment or this portfolio of investments move the needle on making people bike more, walk more, or take public transit. And I'm curious to know if you guys have thought through maybe involving Portland State University, like track, to see whether they might want to do that kind of analysis. And it might be more qualitative. It might be, and I think that there might be two states. There might be like, they might have research on people's opinions and what they would do under certain circumstances that could help guide your decisions and investments, and then doing something after the fact to see, like, did this actually change behavior? And it seems like that could be really important data.
Yeah, Sean, I think the data pieces are key. It not only is helpful for kind of telling the story and articulating the benefits and costs and why those are important, but also, pinpointing investments in the right way. We partner with Oregon State University to do a kind of opinion survey, getting to the exact point that you're mentioning, and it asks questions like, if sidewalks were added in your area, would you start walking more? And things like that. And so, of course, I think people's responses are going to be higher, more favorable towards, yes, of course I would, than we might actually see in reality. But that is part of what we do as a Oregon Household Activity Survey. We partner with Portland State and a few other universities on that and get some travel kind of diary information to back that up. And then there's some good federal resources between kind of the CIAC air quality estimator tool that's out there, and then we do some modeling and analysis as part of the new climate-friendly equitable communities rulemaking that DLCD has done. But I think spot on to figuring out the potential for different types of projects, and I think that's what Suzanne and her team have started to do more in some of the analysis, and then continuing to monitor to see how those play out. I don't know that we're the best at continuing to monitor to see how those things play out and adjusting those metrics.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I just appreciate the conversation. Some really good points that I guess internally we're having similar conversations. That to me is a good check on what conversations are already happening within the agency around this space, and then how you guys are kind of jumping into this conversation around the portfolio approach, the sustainability lens. How are we measuring our success kind of on the total or on the whole? So I guess that's a good affirmation for a lot of the conversations that we're having. I wanted to share just a little perspective, because I think, right, we can set good policies and goals and outcomes, but it's really the people making it happen, right? And that's where we get the benefit. And I think, Shauna, it's a little bit to your point earlier, and it's been said a couple of times around, there are going to be investments that we're going to have to make that are going to have a negative impact on climate. And I'll tell you, over the last 3 years, I think we've been resistant to say that out loud because of the fear that it's going to imply that we're not supportive of moving this needle. And so I think that's part of the culture within the agency, and frankly in the transportation industry, of there are things we still have to do to maintain and manage a functional transportation system that are inherently not supporting the climate goals that we're after. But how do we take it on the total or on the whole? So anyway, it's just fascinating, because this is a burgeoning conversation, right? In the history of 100 years of transportation, this one's pretty young still. And I think this conversation just got me thinking, yeah, we're having the right conversations around. It's going to be uncomfortable, Shauna, to use your point earlier, there's going to be this place of discomfort where we've had past decisions that we're still managing through. At the same time, we're trying to lean in a different direction. And our funding structure is, I think, a classic example of what we're dealing with right now. So anyway, that's a little bit of like me on a soapbox, but I just wanted to share like internally the culture piece of it. I think just hearing this conversation, I think we're headed in the right direction, but we got to give our teams really the authority, the approval, if you will, to say the challenge with this. And I think sometimes we're a little reluctant.
Yeah, go ahead, Shauna, then Amber.
Just a quick question. So historically, ODOT has always been like a construction agency. And over the last few years, you've moved more towards a policy setting agency. But there's still a lot of overlap with DEQ, with ODO, with DLCD. And I'm curious to know if there's been any sort of analysis into like which pieces ODOT owns and has control over, and which pieces already have goals associated with them, but it just lives in another agency. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Sorry, I'm a little slow on the unmute here, so if I may be lagging a little. We do, as part of the same executive order, have an every mile counts effort. So the executive order did lay out specific tasks to different agencies, and where there's that overlap that you're talking about, which is real, there's a bit of it. We work together at Every Mile Counts, and our directors meet every month and staff meets every month. We have an MOU and we have a 2-year work plan. I think there's some areas that are still emerging. We have a lot of conversation with DEQ in our different roles in electrification, especially where it's sort of like a privatized charging. You know, they do some around private fleets and we do public facing charging. And there's probably some areas that are where we're having more discussion about roles. And then with DOE, same thing. And they tend to be a little more resource constrained. And so kind of pitching in as best they can with a lot of data and information and planning studies and so forth. So definitely ongoing conversations and that's part of the work. And then ODOT has a large budget and a large portfolio too. So we've got a lot of herding to do just on our own side. Let me actually, while I have the floor ish, I'll just also mention, you know, there's a lot of projects we get from the local level as well. And so we've been focused on ODOT led projects. And then Amanda mentioned the climate friendly equitable communities. And that's where we're going to provide a lot of consulting support to local jurisdictions around how they're meeting that rulemaking, but also how they're developing projects and selecting projects. So I think more to come, and we can do some evaluation there, but we don't have decision making per se. So that might get something we pick it up more on the evaluation side.
Yeah, so I guess another way to say this too is there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle as we're talking about this. And, you know, Mac's point is spot on. And that's kind of what I was saying, like a programmatic look at things, because we have a lot of things we have to balance as a transportation agency, but on the whole, we should be moving in the right direction. And then how far in the right direction. But in terms of like all the pieces we have, you know, the biggest changes that we're making that's making a huge difference is around the vehicles and fuels. That's resulting in some pretty substantial reductions. I don't think we can take our foot off the accelerator on transportation electrification. Yeah, I love my puns there. I think that's a key one, to continue to invest in charging infrastructure to really accelerate those goals as well. But you know, in addition to that, to Suzanne's point, it's a lot of different entities. And to your point, Shauna, it's, you know, it's DOE, it's DEQ, it's DLCD. We're working with all of them pretty closely to roll out the guidelines. And we really have to be rowing our oars in the same direction to be getting to where we need to go. And the STIP here in our budget decisions for ODOT is a piece of it, because we need to be demonstrating how we can do it. But it's a piece of a much, much larger puzzle.
Go ahead, Amber.
So I just wanted to, I mean, I know you already kind of talked about this, Amanda, but I just want to kind of put an exclamation mark on it, which is, I really agree with Shauna's recommendation around, you know, talking to or collecting data from PSU. So I work with Dr. Gullop there, and he does some fabulous work right around this. And the other reason why I kind of recommend him is because I really see climate and equity are together. I mean, they're absolutely intermittently connected. So I would just encourage you, when you're doing climate, any kind of data collection and analysis around climate, please, I would highly encourage you to also include questions around equity, so as to ensure that you don't then accidentally create an inequity. And then to Mac's point, and this is just an example, to Mac's point, we absolutely have to have other projects that improve the highway infrastructure. It is critical and vital to the economy of the state of Oregon. I mean, transportation is the largest economic engine in the state. And to that point, you may not know this, but I read a study that showed that people of color have there is a disparity in income as a result of not having access to cars. And that is a significant issue. And so for people of color, having access to a car enables them to drive to a location to improve their economic outcomes. So I just want you to think about it also from different angles and different lenses about how to address equity. So that's just something for you to think about.
I agree with that, but I also don't want to, I guess I don't know how to say this, and I'm probably going to offend you, Amber, and I apologize in advance. But I also have seen agencies really grapple with how to balance their policy directives. And so they do nothing. And so I want to, as a group here, think through how we help the agency balance those directives in the case where a project has climate benefit, but you know, may not be fully beneficial to underserved communities or something like that. And I'm a big believer in not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. I don't think that stuff's going to come up all the time. I don't think, you know, I think, Amanda, you said it, like, you know, we can have both and, but I think there are going to be moments where the agency struggles to balance their policy directives. And I don't want to see the agency be paralyzed by that.
Yeah,
And the worst thing that can happen is to do it project by project, because then you don't get the cumulative effect of the benefits that you get from various pieces.
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, that programmatic piece is absolutely essential. And when I say programmatic, I mean the whole of looking at the investment suite. And I think we're starting to, at least I'm hopeful. So I've been in the agency 16 years, done a lot of on the applied side, but mostly on the policy side. And so I'm pretty excited about our Oregon Transportation Plan. I mentioned it multiple times here, but like, I feel like we're starting to get to some good direction in there, and a couple pieces I highlight in terms of, I think, trying to shift that paradigm, Shauna, and get towards our goals while balancing the other interests. We have policy in there that talks about, before we, expand our road system, can we meet the needs, through transportation demand management, through intelligent transportation systems, through more investments in biking and walking in the area, through pricing mechanisms. And then only then, when we're seeing that those aren't addressing the true nature of the problem, do we look at another solution? So we're starting to put some discipline behind how we think about things. And then another example is, getting rid of and eliminating fatalities and serious injuries is paramount. Our job as transportation professionals is to connect people and goods to places, and we need to make sure they can get there safely without loss of life. And so as we do that, we have policy in there that says find safety solutions and countermeasures that don't increase emissions, and when and only when a safety solution increases emissions, but is the only solution to fix the problem. Can you implement that solution? So we're still trying to show kind of like, how do you achieve your climate outcomes? So we're favoring all those types of things that don't increase emissions and address safety. But if that can't get to it, then we're going to increase emissions because we have to save lives.
Yeah, I mean, Shauna, nothing that you said offended me. I'm in total agreement. And I think the way that you just said that just now, Amanda, really is a great example of threading the needle.
But I also think, like, I also think that the agency has to be brave in those moments.
Yeah.
Because it will be really hard in those moments when, like, the environmental community is yelling at you about investing in a project. Like, you're going to have to go back to like what Amber and I keep like pounding the table about, like coming back to the narrative, the story, the portfolio approach, and really like focusing on that, or the programmatic approach, whatever we want to call it. I think that's going to be very important because like it will definitely happen.
Yes, it will.
Shauna, I feel like you were here at the roadmap conference because Tamika Butler gave us those marching orders yesterday to be brave. So you're in good company. So we're still on first question-ish, but I think we've gotten to all three questions actually. We haven't finished, but I think we've covered them all, wove them all in and out. So I guess maybe second call for, are there other ways? Is there anything that we maybe haven't brought in yet, different funding sources or maintenance approach or something where this sort of like upfront investment or scoping and select concept could be applied but isn't? Are there other funding streams, something over in transit? I'm just making it up because what it was isn't in the STIP, but are there other areas that you guys want to touch on?
Well, I'm just curious about, how are we integrating climate change and lower GHG into our maintenance program? I know we have a, kind of a historic, we figure out what the pavement condition is, and then it's based on, which is the highest need. Have we started looking at that and trying to figure out how can we put that lens into our maintenance program?
I can address one thing, Amanda, maybe cue up your thoughts while I'm talking, and Mac. I think for maintenance, we are looking more at adaptation. We have some climate hazard maps, which integrate historic climate hazards, forecasts of future climate hazards, maintenance factors, our priority routes, which to Amber's point is the highest economic driver routes that if they went out would be the most catastrophic, and then also equity. So what is the disparity around that route and what is the equity impact if that route goes out? So I think we're talking definitely about integrating that more into those choices. Probably some folks not on this call don't want to hear any change in prioritization routes, so that's going to be a conversation, but can we start to bring in some of these factors in paving? And then of course, maintenance budget is a big conversation now. And so we're looking ways to align with cost savings. But I think that's only a partial answer. So if others want to share some thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in, and then Mac, certainly welcome your thoughts as well. We absolutely have to do something. And we're looking at ways that we can try to get there. And one of the ways that I think is to, if we wipe the slate clean, what kind of process might we design? And in that regard, I think we've been kind of gravitating towards the potential to pool money together and to have kind of a corridor or segment approach to where you don't have safety just focused on safety objectives. You don't have pavement just focused on pavement conditions. You have kind of that community perspective of here's an area, what are the holistic needs, and how do we start to address multiple of those at the same time to create, a better system. So Great Streets is kind of an example of that. That probably leans a little bit heavier towards the active transportation side. But in a way, I think really driving towards an outcome focused approach that is different than our existing rubric. That said, That's probably something we can do with some of the flexible funds that are available, and those have dwindled more and more over recent years. And so we still have those asset-based programs by which federal funding is directed to. And so within those, as Suzanne's mentioning, how do we create a new lens? So from an equity perspective, there's some maps that are available, and you can look up a project and see, are you, in an area that's benefiting on like a paving project, historically disadvantaged communities. And if 90% of our projects are not, that's a problem. So what's the right threshold there to find some of those things? And I think that's part of the work we're still trying to figure out from the climate perspective of how do we really get in there when it is such an asset focus to look at multiple things. As a quick aside, I think we started to do that a little bit in what we call our active transportation needs inventory, in that we identified gaps in sidewalks and prioritize those based on, are they connected to a school or, some kind of critical location? So you're thinking about more dimensions as you're still developing an asset-based program. So there's some models and examples we might be able to pull from, but that's absolutely something we're still working through and figuring out.
That sounds really cool, that active transportation piece. The one thing I wanted to suggest from a funding perspective is, there's a really robust clean fuels program in the state. It's run by DEQ, and there's a lot of money there. And if DEQ could figure, or ODOT could figure out how to get some of its hands on that money, and maybe using it to pair with NEVI funds to fund heavy duty transportation electrification, things like that along corridors. I think, and it doesn't even maybe it's just partnering with DEQ or partnering with the utilities that have those dollars in those territories could be an interesting way to make dollars go further.
Love it.
Yeah. Mac, then Amber.
Yeah, real quick, Commissioner, I want to go back to your question around maintenance, because I think certainly Suzanne talked about just what are we doing more in the adaptation space, right? What are we experiencing as a result or an effect of climate change? So we think about wildfires, as we think about bigger storms in terms of the magnitude, as we think of just frankly the last 2 months, right, of super cold, rainy to then all of a sudden we're at 90 overnight. We're dealing with flooding in mountain passes right now because everything's melting off so quick, right? So maintenance is dealing with that. I think what's important when I think about this conversation is we talk about it in terms of maintenance, preserving the system, and then building out the system. It's the active transportation needs inventory is a good example. We've still got to build out that system. When we talk about paving, building new bridges, right? It's not new, it's replacing a bridge. So that's preserving the system. And then we get down to maintenance, which is our backstop, right? How are we maintaining the operation of the system? And full circle back to our conversation the last time CIAC met on our budget situation, our structural budget challenge, so much of our conversation today. We are now making some really, really bad decisions in terms of maintenance and what we're capable of doing, like not patching a highway because we don't have the funds to patch it. So it's got to wait till we have a project to preserve that pavement, which is going to be not every 8 to 15 years like we would like, but would be every 50 years. So the impact of that is this unfortunate multiplier. I'll equate it back to this question, Commissioner Smith, that you asked. We're doing work that we're starting this summer on a maintenance program assessment. So it's been a long time since we've fully dived into what are all the things we're trying to do in maintenance? What does our program look like? Part of that's driven by our budget reduction. We're forcing ourselves to say, what are the priorities? And I think a good example of where are we making maintenance decisions that support biking and walking is an example, and where does sweeping a bicycle and pedestrian facility fit into the prioritization of doing anything else in maintenance, right? So how are we having that conversation and fully support the climate and equity connection in that discussion? So that's the work that we're getting kicked off consultant, I think, is close to being awarded the contract. I think we know who it's going to be. So like we're in that stage right now to help inform that program, but also how do we help inform our budget situation of we're going to have to make some really tough choices. So how do we, do that smartly, but also prepare us to make the case for this is an untenable situation for the public to accept. So just wanted to hit that point a little bit clearer around maintenance.
Well, and I just to kind of piggyback on what you just said, Mac, and what Amanda said earlier, maybe, and I'm just making this up. I mean, literally, I'm just making this up right now. But maybe what you do is like because your first question is the climate lens. And so maybe I don't know what the criteria you are using with regard to the climate lens, but maybe you add, especially with regard to maintenance, maybe you add, and with the climate lens, you add some kind of transportation disadvantage index scoring that includes like, I don't want like a couple different things that then adds into the weighting. So like Title I schools, income, some kind of income that then leads to an overall transportation disadvantage index scoring or something like that. Anyways, just an idea.
Yeah, I'll say just real quick, Amber, I think that's part of like the how do we think about maintenance as a program, right? Because even in that, we were just talking about, we don't want to analyze every project based on the
Exactly.
we want to look at the portfolio.
Exactly.
Same thing. How do we look at our program, our maintenance activities? And that's a little bit, I think, to how do we give ourselves the authority to talk about the role and that maintenance serves in the climate equity space. And if I think about like plowing snow, right, like how important that is to the vitality of Oregonians, regardless of your race or color, right? Where you live, are you in a disadvantaged community or not? Like you can't get the product that you need. And so like, how do we talk about the role of maintenance to serve those functions? So anyway.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Paul.
Max, the only thing I was going to mention was that now that states are required to do asset management plans, statewide, in those plans, mostly you're seeing the climate resilience approach get tied into those asset management, not just preservation, not just maintenance, but your assets being managed as a whole. So maybe thinking about it in terms of both, and then adding a resilience layer will help connect those better.
Yeah, good point, Paula. And I think just many years ago, Amanda and I were in a conversation when this notion of climate resiliency came up. And there was a conversation, I remember it very vividly in the agency of, should we talk about climate resiliency or should we talk about resiliency or should we talk about climate resiliency and seismic resiliency? And there was a decision at that point, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, they're separate. We don't want to conflate this. We want to keep climate and seismic resiliency separate. And I think we're now saying, no, we have to kind of think about this in this broader term. And I think asset management, right, is another form of resiliency, right? How do we have a resilience? And we're seeing some of our not
man-made and nature-made threats to the system.
Yep.
Maybe just do a time check here, because I think we also need, are we planning to cover?
We didn't have anything queued up for EV. I think we can leave some time and space there and give you some updates and have a little discussion. But I'd be interested to touch a little bit more before we go on that, on measurement and how much is enough. I think in the interest of time, I won't go deep on how we did evaluate, but we had 2 different ways that we evaluated the phase 1 and phase 2 that I talked about. And we had some consultants and it was a heavy lift. And a lot of the heavy lift was just, did we have the info we need at the time we needed it? And we were making up methodologies as we went as well. But we came up with some good results. We did a qualitative assessment, which again was where the dollars going and what outcomes do we expect per dollar spent if it's a bike lane versus a bridge versus a culvert versus a road expansion, et cetera. And so that was for a subset of the ODOT-led projects, just the construction-only ones that we felt like the STIP investment was making that final commitment and getting it built. Whereas a planning project might not be built. So we kind of took credit or deficit for what was getting built. And then I might have just mixed that up because I was going to go next to the quantitative one, excuse me, where we measured whether when we're touching the system, were we reducing or increasing the vehicle miles traveled and the emissions in a quantitative sense. And we were able to get information on enough projects to run kind of a subset of the projects through that methodology. But I'll say that it was a lot of work. And so we're working upstream kind of with what data is collected on a project level and how it's stored and how do we access it. A lot of information changes as it goes. We haven't even finalized the STIP yet. So as those draft project lists went to 150% to 100%, and just a lot of things were in motion all at one time. So I know I'm giving you kind of a broad question, but like, I think the public has an interest in knowing what these outcomes might be, but how do we also know internally? And I don't mean to say like when's enough, because it's not that we want to not get a full assessment of where we're going and how well it went, but what might be some, what might the commission be looking for? What might the public be looking for? What might be some helpful things to help us assess whether it's success or not?
I would, as long as it's fairly easy, like capture as many metrics as you can, so that you can kind of slice and dice them down the road. Because you don't know what that sort of programmatic look is going to tell you. But I would also say, and maybe this is the exact opposite of what I just said, like you want to keep it kind of simple too. Like don't kill yourself. Like don't make it so complicated that you're spending all your time measuring. Like the job of the agency isn't to measure, it's to do, right? So figuring out what that balance is. And as I say this, I realize just how useless comment this is, but I think metrics are really important, but I also don't want to see the agency be really paralyzed by measurement. I'm really sorry that that wasn't more useful.
I liked it. I just couldn't get off mute. No, I think that's true. I think we are here to do it. And so sometimes when we get a lot of inquiries into what did we measure and where are we today, it's hard to say, hey, that needs to happen next year because we're still in the middle of something else. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I want the agency to get more comfortable being like, sorry, we don't have that and we're not going to have that. No, we did this project that did increase greenhouse gas emissions, but if you look at it again with our portfolio, like it is overall beneficial to the climate. Like really like sticking to those lines and being unapologetic about where you do have information, where you don't, why you have that information, why you don't, just like instead of like, I don't know, I'm not from here, I'm from Philadelphia, like sort of like the overly apologetic, like, oh, I'm so sorry, like we'll get that to you, like, and I realize we're like, ODOT, like, you're all public servants, but yeah, and I just don't want to see the agency like be paralyzed by gathering information. Also, this is why I would be a terrible elected official.
I realized
Straight
that
talk.
my computer died probably when Shauna was giving a really important point that I absolutely agree with, but I heard the last few seconds and I feel very strongly, and I know Mac, you're there, and Amanda, like, in our previous conversations, we had conversations about the communications of ODOT. And, I so strongly agree with the last part that Shauna said, which is, ODOT is doing really great work, in which case sometimes you have to say no. Transparency is about acknowledging where things can be influenced and where things cannot be influenced. And it builds trust, and sometimes it will make people very unhappy, but you're being honest, you're being direct, you're being clear, and that builds a relationship. So
Yeah, thank you, Amber. I think that's right. And that's part of the points Matt was hitting on earlier as he was talking about maintenance is like, here's the reality in which we're operating on and like what we can do and what we can't. But I think that's absolutely right. And, we continue in many spaces to operate at a trust deficit, and that's not helping us. And so the more that we can have these open, honest conversations, I think the better. So appreciate that empowerment in many ways.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks.
You just real quick, I can't help but add here. I think for years we struggled with how do we even talk about the state of the system, right, from a resiliency standpoint, because we didn't want to say we had a big problem, right, or we talked about it in a way that wasn't as obvious. And I think back to Amanda's point around the power of the and, I think that's the struggle we have right now of one, our budget situation that we have staring at us, the lack of federal funding for a lot of these areas that we need to invest in. That funding is not going up, even with the passage of IIJA, which is great. It's not keeping up with inflation. So as an example, we want to build out the bicycle and pedestrian system, but at the same time, we have one paving project in the entire Region 1 area of Portland in the next 4 years. So like our opportunity to maximize that is not where it used to be. And it's not a trade-off of one of those values over the other. It's the reality of, okay, so now expanding the bicycle and transportation or pedestrian system is now going to be solely owned by that project to do that because we don't have the funding to do a paving project at the same time. So anyway, we're starting to say that more because it's that dire. In 2027 and beyond, we will likely only be paving interstates. So in 2027 and beyond, only paving interstates. So our opportunity to do anything off the interstate is going to be super compromised. Paula, I was watching your face there when I said that. It's not a good moment, but I think
that's scary.
Yeah, we're being really candid about saying that now. It's tough.
You have to be candid about saying that. Like you have to be, but and again, back to telling the story, like you have to be telling the story. Like we are an implementing agency. Here's how our hands are tied. And I think it's important for ODOT to think of itself as an implementing agency. Like you guys are the doers, right? You're not the planners like CPUC or DEQ or ODO. Like you guys are the doers. And so I think framing it as such, not to put the other agencies down, but I think it's important for folks to understand how it actually impacts, like, and here's a good pun, like where the rubber hits the road.
Sounds good to me. And I think our third question, which was on low emission materials and adaptation, I think we've touched on that, and we will start bringing those forward the same as we did with climate mitigation in the climate lens, so that we're looking at mitigation, adaptation, and low carbon materials, and then also equity, which I don't bring up much in the front end, but I think we know that we're on a parallel path and working to integrate as best as possible, make sure we are in good communication with the Office of Social Equity and Civil Rights, and make sure that our work's in alignment there.
Well, I don't know if you have other topics that you wanted to cover. I think we had a little transition in staffing and maybe not the best communication on what exactly was all going to be on the agenda. But are there any other thoughts or questions you have or any ideas from the group?
I think, Chair,
Well,
if
okay.
there's things that you want, I mean, we certainly have updates on like where we are with transportation electrification, the NEVI funds, what additional federal grants we're applying on, some of those kind of things. So if anyone has interest, certainly happy to share an update.
And I'll just mention that, yeah, I think we have a placeholder for these topics, and we brought forward the STIP one because speaking of doing, we're knee deep in grant applications on the EV side, but yeah, we can certainly have a open conversation. We just didn't prepare a particular question.
That's fine. Amber, you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to, this is my last meeting here, and I just wanted to make a couple like final remarks, but I can wait until at the end if you want to go through the other topics.
Now is a great time.
Okay. So I just wanted to say this to you, Mac, and all of the ODOT leadership that's watching. You know, I've been working with ODOT for, I don't know, a long time. 8 years. And I just want to say, I just want you to see yourself for a minute. So ODOT staff by their nature are engineers and they're risk adverse by education and training so as to ensure people don't die. And I just need you to acknowledge the amount of change that has happened within your organization in the last 2 years, 3 years. The amount of change that you have created within your organization is massive. They're probably bigger than anything I have seen for the size of your organization is enormous. And so I just say this because one, you should be proud of the work that you're doing and the change that you have had to manage within a culture that is trained to not change. Okay. And I say that to just offer just one little tiny insight for you as executives. The more that you listen to the ideas that Shauna has, which is to be upfront. No, I'm serious, baby. I'm serious. To be upfront. That's something that ODOT staff are not comfortable with. Being direct, being unapologetic, sharing those views, storytelling. That's a different way than you view yourselves. But you're learning that that's a key role that you as policymakers and executives play. Anyways, I just wanted to offer that insight. And I've worked with agencies all over the nation, and you just should really be proud of the work that you're doing. Yeah.
Amen.
Well, I think just Amber too, thanks for your service on this committee and advice and pushing and support at the same time. Oftentimes we get pushing without the support, and it's helpful to have the combination. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I've really appreciated your insights and your perspective, because I think it's has served our committee well, and I think made a lot of great suggestions that I think we're implementing and will continue to implement. So you've definitely made your mark, and we appreciate all the time and effort you put in, and understand when you hit a limit, you gotta say no.
You are a ray of light. I won't miss you. And you're brilliant, not just because you always agree with me, but because of all the additional ideas you bring.
Well, is there anything else? There isn't any reason we have to go the whole hour and a half if we don't have other topics.
It's been a good meeting, a lot to think about. And I think I, for one, am going to go do a little research and see what we can find about what states are doing and private sectors doing on some of these challenges and these programmatic kinds of issues.
And just, I think, Paula, you might have missed the beginning of this. We are having a little staffing transition, and I'm not going to be in person at the next meeting. So we're going to reach out and decide whether or not we're going to try and do a hybrid or just do another Zoom meeting, and we'll let everybody.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Great job, everybody.
You get 15 minutes back in your day. Go outside.
Thank you all so much for the great feedback.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.